My name is Colleen Jaurretche. I teach at UCLA, and I'm one of the organizers of this event. I'm very grateful to the Huntington for making this possible, and I'd like to introduce our panel and our panelists. First, Eric Bolson. He is the Andrew W. Mellon All Claremont Chair in the Humanities. His recent book, Ulysses by Numbers, has had wide reviews and very enthusiastic responses. He's also the author of Cambridge Companion to the novel and the Cambridge Introduction to James Joyce. Eric has published widely on an array of subjects, including many and frequent contributions to Times Literary Supplement. And we also have Shinjani Chatopathy. She is a very recent, congratulations to her, PhD from Notre Dame, so we're going to give her a hand. She graduated a week ago Monday, so we're really very excited about this. She specializes in global Anglophone, post-colonial, and world literature with an interest in space and cosmopolitanism. She is the Marion L. Brittian Postdoc Fellow at Georgia Tech. And she has articles forthcoming in James Joyce Quarterly, European Joyce Studies, Joyce in Italy, and Modernism and Modernity. And we also would like to welcome Roshana Zimmering. Roshana is the professor of English and director of gender studies at Lewis and Clark. And her book, Social Dance and the Modernist Imagination in Interwar Britain, is a wonderful book. So I welcome all of our panelists.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. This feels so much better in person. We had to do a run-through just in case everything went sideways, and I had to film it on screen, and I'll tell you, this feels a lot better than that did. So thanks to the organizers, of course, this is really an incredible occasion to be a part of, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I do want to clarify before I get started. I know the clock is already ticking, but I've had a few people ask me why I feel so much regret with James Joyce. It's not rue as in I rue the day I met James Joyce. I was actually using the French term rue, as will become very clear. Maybe I do rue it now, but I didn't then when I came up with this. Okay. So, rue James Joyce. Don't try and Google it. This particular street doesn't exist. But it very well could have. The whole idea can be traced back to a remark made by Richard Aldington, one of the original members of the Imagist movement, who spent some time on the left bank. It's surprising, he wrote in the mid-1920s, that the Paris municipality, with its passion for honoring artists by giving their names to streets, didn't change the Rue de l'Odéon to Rue James Joyce. It's really not such a crazy idea. Joyce's Ulysses put Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare & Company on the map. And if modernism was ever to have a single street address, 12 Rue de l'Odéon would be it. Beach's bookshop would finally close its doors in 1941, not long after the Nazis arrived. But the street name remained the same, and if you go there today, you'll find a small plaque on the wall indicating that in 1922, in this building, Mademoiselle Sylvia Beach published Ulysses by James Joyce. Now, that's one way we can continue to celebrate 12 Rue de l'Odéon. The Paris municipality, if it chose to, could also have written that it was the spot once frequented by the likes of André Breton or Valéry Larbaud, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. It was actually the same place that Gertrude Stein avoided going at certain hours of the day, precisely to avoid bumping into, you guessed it, James Joyce. But I'm not here today to argue about whether or not Paris ever needed or will need a Rue James Joyce. And the last thing I want to do is to repeat the oft-told story about the publication of Ulysses that so many of you are familiar with already. Instead, I'd rather use what little time I have today to think more about the meaning and perhaps the function of such storied addresses. Those locations that we as critics, fanatics, casual readers use to anchor the literary past. And to get working through the problem, I want to consider a few related questions. These are going to be kinds of things I'm touching on. How did Sylvia Beach imagine 12 Rue de l'Odéon? What about her contemporaries, Joyce included? And what does that mean for us now in 2022? How might our own geographical sensibilities in an age of digital cartography and computational methods help us understand what 12 Rue de l'Odéon can mean, and what it can tell us about anything, or whether it can tell us anything, about the possibilities and limits of a spatially conceived literary history? So, I'll begin with Beach. Shakespeare and Company did not open on the Rue de l'Odéon. It was originally located around the corner on 8 Rue du Pitron. At first, Beach, an American, was thrilled to have her own bookshop and lending library conveniently placed in the heart of the left bank. But there was a problem. It was hard to find. The Rue du Pitron was a very small street positioned between two larger ones that intersected at the Boulevard Saint-Germain. Catering specifically to English and American literature, word quickly spread to the expat community, and before long, Robert McGowan, George Antheil, Gertrude Stein, and Alice B. Toklas were popping in to buy, sell, talk about, and borrow books. The newly arrived Ezra Pound and Dorothy Shakespeare, they also made their way there, but were not convinced that others would follow suit. Dorothy Shakespeare decided that a hand-drawn map might do the trick. It worked. This map, Beach would later recall in her memoir, guided many a customer to Shakespeare and Company, and it's among the treasures of those first days of my bookshop. Now, as you can see for yourself, Dorothy Shakespeare's map is not very elaborate. A few street names, with the Metro Odéon and the Place de l'Odéon functioning as the more familiar Parisian landmarks. In the middle of Rue du Pitron is a small rectangle indicating the shop's exact location. The final printed version turned out a bit differently. Now we find the name of Beach's bookshop, but instead of orienting the map around the Place de l'Odéon at the bottom, the Carrefour de l'Odéon is prominently positioned at the top. Most importantly, you will no doubt have noticed something else: the addition of a new landmark, Adrien Monier's Maison des Amis de Livres at the address 7 Rue de l'Odéon. So, why might this particular revision of the map even matter? Well, so far as I can tell, it shows us that Shakespeare and Company may have opened its doors on 8 Rue du Pitron, but it was immediately affiliated with the already established French bookshop on the Rue de l'Odéon. Without Maison des Amis de Livres, the history of Shakespeare and Company would no doubt have unfolded rather differently. And here I want to emphasize something else. The physical distance between the bookshops was itself overcome by an imaginative cartographic one. From the beginning, Beach was able to put Shakespeare and Company on the Rue de l'Odéon without actually being there. It was a strategic move that made it possible for her to capitalize on the established intellectual reputation of her French ally, while still advertising a degree of autonomy. Beach eventually moved her bookshop to number 12 Rue de l'Odéon in the summer of 1921, boasting to friends that she was Americanizing the street. Monnier, of course, had other ideas about the neighborhood that she referred to affectionately as Odéonia. Beach was, by her account, one more convert to a Parisian-based World Republic of Letters, République Mondiale des Lettres. But no matter. For Archibald MacLeish, it was the presence of both bookshops directly across the street from one another that transformed literary Paris of the 1920s and 30s into the stuff of myth. Turning up from Saint-Germain to home past the bottom of the gardens of the Boulevard Saint-Michel, one kept Shakespeare and Company to starboard and Adrien Monier's Amis de Livres to port, and felt that one had passed the gates of dream. As evidenced here, that was my voice of Archibald MacLeish. I have no idea what he sounded like. As evidenced here, the Rue de l'Odéon was more than a street. It was the word for a literary modernity that was very much in progress, a signifier of the idea that the mythical literary present could even have an address in the real world. Now, Marjorie Reed, writing for an American audience in the New York Times, she would put it this way: if, as Cicero said, the library is the soul of the house, Shakespeare and Company may be described as the soul of the American literary circle in Paris. To it come sooner or later all lovers of the printed word, from Podunk, Maine to Pasadena, California. I didn't plan on that. It just happened. But if 12 Rue de l'Odéon would function as the de facto address of the so-called lost generation and the literary tourists who followed in their footsteps, what changed it all was the arrival of one exiled Irishman. Not only did James Joyce actually end up using Shakespeare and Company to send and receive his personal mail, it was the one address that would get printed on the bibliographical page of Ulysses when it first appeared in 1922. Now, with so many of the other editions of the novel available today, and actually, thanks to Catherine, she's going to remind us that we need to look at this again, it can be easy to forget that 12 Rue de l'Odéon was prominently displayed on one of the opening pages of Joyce's novel before the arrival of stately, plump Buck Mulligan. It's an address there to remind readers that Joyce wasn't the only exile. Ulysses was too, a novel written in English, more or less, that needed this address precisely because it could not be published in any English-speaking country. So, earlier I asked what 12 Rue de l'Odéon might have meant to Beach, the proprietor. So now I want to consider what it might have meant to James Joyce, the author. Would it really have mattered, for instance, if Ulysses was published on 8 Rue du Pitron? Now, I think so. Odéon, as the Latin and Greek etymologies suggest, is a place for musical entertainment, hence the root ode or song. Du Pitron has a significantly less romantic etymological pedigree. It's a surname, one that belongs to a 19th century surgeon, once the richest man in France at the time, who was made famous and given his own street, many believed, because of his successful treatment of the hemorrhoids of Prince President Louis Napoleon. And there's a joke there somewhere, but as you can see from this one flyer, the publication from Rue du Pitron was indeed a possibility, a great what-if in the catalog of famous book addresses in literary history. Beach, as we know, had agreed to publish Ulysses when her shop was still at this original site. But once Shakespeare and Company moved from one rue to another, so too would the address on the announcements. The substitution of 812 of Rue du Pitron to the Rue de l'Odéon was indeed significant. And Joyce, as I'll explain, took this opportunity to make what I'll call a symbolic address to the reader. Looking at the proofs of the bibliographical page from late January 1921, we discovered that the only significant revision involved adding and then recentering the full name of the bookshop, Shakespeare and Company. The street, the city, and the date are all left as is. And here we need to read them, I think, as a single unit. You have the number, the street, the city, and of course, the year. It was customary for French publishers in the 1920s to include a street address along with the name of the publishing house. Less common, however, was the repetition of the street number before and after the street name. So here, for example, we come across 12, Rue de l'Odéon, 12. Now, that would have made perfect sense if Shakespeare and Company was in the 12th arrondissement, and more likely if that second 12 were a Roman numeral. But having gone through hundreds of pages of subscription forms, notebooks, address books, and letters from Beach's massive archive at Princeton, I can confirm this particular formatting of the address is an aberration. The correct address is 12 Rue de l'Odéon, 16e, the 6th arrondissement. And it's there, for instance, on the subscription forms. And this is my arrow. It's just right up there at the top. There's another one. It's there for the flyers of the lending library, 12 Rue de l'Odéon, 16e. And as you saw before, it's there for the prospectuses of the book. Right? So what's happening? Well, it means that this variation, 12 Rue de l'Odéon 12, represents something else. But what? That's the mystery. When I first started thinking about this problem, if it is a problem, I don't know, it's my problem, I reached out to Josh Cotton, the director of the Shakespeare and Company, Director of the Shakespeare and Company Project. Shakespeare and Company's long gone. The Shakespeare and Company Project at Princeton. He reached out to the late Michael Grodin, who in turn reached out to Daniel Ferrer, and I think there are a few others in there, who reminded us all that the Nouvelle Revue Française, right there, was in fact one of the few places at the time where you'd find this kind of numerical doubling. 78 Rue de l'Assas, 78, as you can see here, is stamped on the front cover of the NRF. Curious, though, to find that the same convention didn't actually carry over to the NRF's book series. And it's not something you'd see, for instance, on their edition of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. But if it's not a nod to the NRF, which it could be, there's also a possibility that the two 12s are there for the sake of symmetry. And that would work if you consider that 12 and 12 frame Odeon, a word, as I mentioned before, with the ode in it, a poetic form that relies on repetition, but also sharing in common the first few letters of Odyssée, the French title for the Greek epic whose plot is organized around a homecoming, the place to end your journey where you began. So, all of this symbolic riffing can certainly be done with various degrees of seriousness, and you can play with it as much as you want. But we shouldn't forget to factor in the numbers themselves. It's not 3, 8, 4, or 9 Rue de l'Odeon. It's 12. And it's not Paris in 1921, and I should mention that 1921 was the year Joyce did not want to publish Ulysses because he was convinced that 1921 was bad luck because it added up to the number 13. And if you don't believe me, it's in the letters and you can look for yourself, and I can give you the date. I'd be happy to provide it. The number is 1922. So 12/12/1922 was an opportunity to bring the birth date of Ulysses and the birthday of its author together on the bibliographical page of the novel. 22/22, the day, the month, the year, intertwined with the street and city where the novel first appeared. But what better way to bring the life of the author and the birth of the book together? Joyce was turning 40, as you've heard so many times already, as copies of this newly born Ulysses were arriving on the express train from Dijon. How many copies? 2. He didn't plan that either, okay. That timestamp with a birth date and a birthday works just as well today, to February 2022. And it will again when Ulysses celebrates its bicentennial, when all of us are long gone. But unless you're reading one of the impressions published by Beach between 1922 and 1930, this little numerical puzzle has long since disappeared. The first American edition in 1934, in fact, failed even to mention Shakespeare and Company or its address. And the so-called Gobbler edition in 1984 rescued Beach's bookshop and put it in the front page, but removed the rue where it was once located. So I don't suspect that any of the original subscribers to Ulysses would have picked up on any of this I'm talking about now. And I've never seen anything like it, but perhaps there is. But the hundreds who subscribed, those who returned the original subscription form sent out by Beach, would at least have been familiar with that original address. From 2 February 1922 onwards, 12 Rue de l'Odeon was not just the place for expats in Paris to find an English bookshop, it was the place from which Ulysses first set sail. Joyce may have wanted to make this street belong to him, but he was, I think, seriously mistaken. Rue de l'Odeon was always more than the publisher of a single book. It was then, and remains now, a place with a before Ulysses and an after. And there's one more related point to make. Rue de l'Odeon, where am I? And there's one more related point to make. Rue de l'Odeon, no matter its global reach or world historical significance, was still very much a street in Paris. Because of Beach and Monier's incredible networking skills, they were able to enlist subscribers from every arrondissement. 119 of them agreed to buy 254 copies from the original batch of 1,000. That's 1/4 of the entire first run. A number that reminds us just how much the Ulysses of 2222 was a Parisian affair. And maybe that was what Gertrude Stein had in mind when she told a journalist from the Paris Tribune that Joyce is good, but his influence is local. Local, maybe for a little while, but also ephemeral. Joyce would turn his attention to other streets around Paris after 1922, but the Rue de l'Odéon would endure. And by the 1930s, another wave of exiles was arriving. One of them, the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, or philosopher and literary critic. In the 7 years or so that he lived there, Benjamin would become a cherished friend of Beach and Monnier. And like Joyce, he spent some of his time writing about the native city he left behind. But it was when Benjamin was forced to leave Paris with the impending Nazi invasion that the true meaning of this storied street arrived with startling clarity. In his last letter to Monnier, Benjamin would write, "I think of you. I will think of you constantly as long as Paris is in any danger. My mind turns to you not only when I think of Paris, but also when I think of the Rue de l'Odéon, which I would commend to the protection of the most powerful and least petitioned of all divinities." Like Proust's own narrator, the reference to a beloved street brings Benjamin to the memory of a beloved person, and it is an act of remembering made more acute by the future possibility that it soon may be destroyed. Benjamin personifies the Rue de l'Odéon, his memory a map of places in Paris held together by the people who dwell there. Monnier and Beach would make it, Benjamin would not. But the Rue de l'Odéon, as we know, has long outlasted all this entire generation of exiles, expats, emigres, and locals. They made it such a kind of mythical literary landmark. But Benjamin's last dispatch serves as a reminder that its significance will always exceed any single historical event, literary work, avant-garde movement, or person. And I know it sounds heretical to say this, Joyce included. It's the name for something that once was, but also will be. A location for the future that can't be found on any map, in part because it was never there in the first place. Still, to quote Benjamin once more, there is a peculiar voluptuousness to the naming of streets. And I'm willing to bet that Benjamin had one street in mind when he wrote this line, and it wasn't, and it never will be, Rue James Joyce. Time's up. That was it. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here at the Huntington, and thank you so much to the conference organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference. Today, I will be talking about the Wandering Rocks episode in Ulysses. And as you can see from my title slide, the title of my presentation is Looking Beyond Maps, Examining the Decolonial Tours in Wandering Rocks. Wandering Rocks is one of the only two episodes in Ulysses which does not directly focus on either Leopold Bloom or Stephen Dedalus. The episode creates a compilation of most of the characters that populate the universe of Ulysses and indicates all the alternative narrative strands that the novel could have pursued. The 19 subsections of Wandering Rocks offer fragmented glimpses of the interconnected movements of individual characters across Dublin. In this presentation today, I study how some of the characters in the episode closely engage with Dublin sites and landmarks, and I argue that Wandering Rocks establishes a critical cosmopolitanism by forging discursive tours. Let me begin with what is critical cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism, in the classical scenic and Stoic sense, is defined as transcending parochialism and cultivating active interests in cultures beyond that of one's own. However, theorist of decoloniality, Walter Mignolo, notes that classical and later Kantian cosmopolitanism has implicit imperial biases. Mignolo proposes the model of critical cosmopolitanism to decolonize the idea of political and cultural cosmopolitanism. He defines critical cosmopolitanism as a decolonial form of cosmopolitanism that emerges from the margins and recognizes coloniality as the darker side of modernity. Critical cosmopolitanism, Mignolo writes, emerges from the various spatial and historical locations of colonial difference. It challenges the homogeneity imposed on global cultures by Eurocentrism. Critical cosmopolitanism studies how communities build multicultural connections from the interstices of national borders across the global north and the global south, and generate varied responses to coloniality. I illustrate that Wandering Rocks constitutes an instance of critical cosmopolitanism by examining how different characters formulate a range of responses to Dublin's colonial modernity in this episode. Wandering Rocks carefully depicts the metropolitan labyrinths of 1904 Dublin and offers a vast repository of local details. The long catalogue of street names, landmarks, and monuments emphasize the mimetic specificity of the episode. Frank Budgeon has famously noted that Joyce composed the episode with a map of Dublin before him and calculated to a minute the time necessary for his characters to cover a given distance of the city. While Budgeon's observation emphasizes Joyce's careful efforts to maintain vraisemblance in depicting Dublin, it must also be noted that Joyce constructed the 1904 Dublin in this episode, as in the rest of Ulysses, with a temporal distance of more than a decade. The retrospective glance in the episode infuses the mimetic specificity of Dublin with transhistoricism and transnationalism. Wandering Rocks situates the granular details of 1904 Dublin within a network of transnational exchanges. The episode depicts Dublin as a center of metropolitan modernity and at the same time acknowledges it as a colonial outpost which is considered to be on the margins of modernity. It depicts Dublin as a historical palimpsest that is in the process of negotiating with its feudal past and impending industrial future. In Wandering Rocks, Dublin emerges as a location that hosts the multifariousness of Irish identities that are being shaped by the sometimes contradictory forces of anti-colonial resistance, nostalgia for a bygone past, and commitment to a cosmopolitan modernity. Joyce scholars have extensively studied maps and mapping in Ulysses, and especially in Wandering Rocks. Such cartographical approaches provide the essential foundation to analyze the vast repository of local details that Joyce carefully curates in Wandering Rocks. However, according to Michel de Certeau, whose coming was foretold many times in Catherine Flynn's talk this morning, that Michel de Certeau says that maps can occasionally produce homogenizing observations, so the bad maps that, again, Catherine Flynn mentioned in the morning. So de Certeau defines maps as a plane projection totalizing observations. De Certeau explains it as a way of seeing that elicits the knowledge of an order of places. Rather than inhabiting a particular space, the map assumes an extrinsic view which can consume said space in an all-encompassing gaze. De Certeau describes this as the colonization of space because in assuming this extrinsic view or the synoptic view, the map does not recognize the human practices that leave traces on the space. In its expansive gaze, the map puts together diverse places, obliterates their distinctiveness and internal boundaries, and represents them as homogeneous. Maps, following the definitions of de Certeau, are not suitable, thus, to study the cosmopolitanism of a location. As opposed to maps, according to de Certeau, discursive tours better illustrate the diversity of local details. De Certeau says that tours spatialize action, such as you turn right and come into the living room, and tours show how movements weave together diverse elements of space. Whereas maps produce an all-encompassing view of space, tours make the internal frontiers of space more conspicuous by showing the breaks and turns in movements. Therefore, I propose that discursive tours help analyze the critical cosmopolitanism of local details in Wandering Rocks. I showed that Wandering Rocks, in addition to mapping Dublin, also creates discursive tours of the city by closely following the breaks and turns in the various trajectories of the characters. The tours, instead of mapping movements, focus on the pauses and moments of stillness in movements. These moments of stillness illustrate the multiple layers of historical and cultural sedimentation of specific sites of Dublin. They ultimately lead to the generation of a critical cosmopolitanism by revealing how various characters respond to Dublin's colonial differences. The critical cosmopolitanism of Wandering Rocks begins with acknowledging the long-standing colonial history of the city. For instance, the multi-layered past of Dublin becomes evident when Ned Lambert, a seed merchant, presents a glimpse of the complicated history of the city to Reverend Hugh C. Love, a clergyman who is recording the history of the Fitzgeralds, an Anglo-Irish family with long-standing heritage going all the way back to the 12th century. Lambert stands in St. Mary's Abbey and announces, I quote, "This is the most historic spot in all Dublin. The old Bank of Ireland was over the way till the time of the Union, and the original Jews' temple was here too, before they built their synagogues over in Adelaide Road," unquote. In a few sentences, Lambert shows how a single Dublin landmark can contain transhistorical traces from the city's medieval past to its colonial present. He is correct in pointing out that St. Mary's Abbey is one of the most historic landmarks of the city. The 10th century abbey was the oldest religious establishment in Dublin. Similar to the city, the abbey also underwent several stages of transformation. In the 12th century, it became a Cistercian abbey, and in 1537, it was dissolved. It was later damaged by fire, and the surviving parts of the abbey was incorporated in the premises of Messrs. Alexander and Company seed merchants. Thus, the abbey began as a medieval religious institution and ultimately became part of a modern commercial establishment. St. Mary's Abbey, in addition to signifying the heterogeneous religious heritage of Ireland, also stands to witness the historically tumultuous relations between Ireland and England. Lambert notes that Ireland's relation with England continues to remain tempestuous when he draws attention next to the Bank of Ireland. He notes that the Bank of Ireland used to be located near St. Mary's Abbey till the Acts of Union 1800. When he mentions a connection between the Bank of Ireland and the Acts of Union 1800, he again reminds the reader of the turbulent colonial relations between Ireland and England. The Acts of Union 1800 united the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which was of course later repealed when the Republic of Ireland was formed. When the Irish Parliament was dissolved by the Acts of Union, the House of Parliament was sold to the Bank of Ireland, and it moved to a new location. The Bank of Ireland thus embodies the history of the dissolution of the Irish Parliament. When Lambert draws attention to the former location of the Bank of Ireland, he indicates an absent landmark. The landmark, by virtue of its absence, becomes emblematic of Ireland's subjugated sovereignty to England. It is, of course, the viceregal cavalcade that makes the most explicit the colonizer-colonized hierarchy. William Humble Ward, 2nd Earl of Dudley, accompanied by his entourage, goes to inaugurate the Miras Bazaar in Pembroke in his capacity as the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. His cavalcade begins at the Viceregal Lodge in Phoenix Park and creates a grand spectacle when it traverses various streets of Dublin. The trajectories of most characters who appear in Wandering Rocks intersect with the itinerary of the cavalcade, and the characters generate varied responses to it. The episode describes at length how various onlookers view the cavalcade, but it does not reveal how the Lord Lieutenant views the crowd and the streets of Dublin until the very end of the episode. The omission of the Lord Lieutenant's point of view reminds the reader of the silencing of Heinz's Irish in Telemachus. The British aristocrat, similar to Heinz, whose knowledge about Irish culture is superficial, is also detached from Irish traditions. His carriage traverses the historic streets of Dublin, but he pays little attention to the local details of the city or its people. The Lord Lieutenant is only interested in particular vignettes of Irish history which celebrate England's colonial domination. He overlooks most Dublin landmarks and happens to incidentally pause to acknowledge only a particular house that Queen Victoria is arguably said to have admired on her visit to Dublin in 1849. His version of Dublin's history dismisses iconic landmarks and monuments in Ireland's past. His iteration of history stands as an instance of how colonial hegemony suppresses the many histories of colonized communities. The viceregal cavalcade across the city thus shows the power imbalance between the imperial center and the colonial outpost. Wandering Rocks does not represent colonial control over Ireland in isolation. It encloses it within the dichotomy of the church and the state. Joyce scholars have pointed out that whereas the viceregal cavalcade represents the aegis of imperialism, Father Conmee, at the beginning of the episode, represents the church. Although Father Conmee is seen in the episode serving the community by trying to do a good turn to the Dignam family, he represents a counterpart to the Lord Lieutenant to some extent. Whereas the Lord Lieutenant follows a selective history of Ireland, Father Conmee commemorates an idyllic history. Both modes of history result in an imaginative detachment from reality. When Father Conmee walks on Malahide Road, instead of thinking about the Dignam family, he lets his mind wander off to the medieval sagas about the family of the Lords Talbot of Malahide. He nostalgically reminisces, and I quote, "Those were old worldish days, loyal times in joyous townlands," unquote. He imagines a bygone idyllic past where everything was happy and peaceful. His use of the word townlands confirms his hankering for the past because the word is emblematic of ancient landholdings in Ireland. He conveniently disremembers moments of conflict, such as the chaotic periods of the famine and the land disputes, and even dismisses the contemporary situation of brewing tension between England and Ireland, feared to give way to an armed rebellion. This helps him to artificially construct an image of uninterrupted prosperity in Ireland. He disapproves of the solemnity of his fellow passengers on the tram and hopes everyone to uphold a cheerful decorum. His inability to empathize with the solemnity of his fellow passengers at a time when a large part of Dublin's population is ravaged by poverty shows his disconnection from reality to a certain extent. It suggests his disregard for the colonial condition of Ireland and his dismissal about the impoverishment of his fellow Dubliners, which renders him unable to sustain a cheerful decorum. Father Conmee's detachment from reality is made the most obvious when he boards a tram at Newcomen Bridge because he dislikes traversing on foot the dingy way past Mud Island. Father Conmee, by taking the tram, intentionally circumnavigates the squalor of Dublin. His engagement with Dublin suggests that although he traverses the streets of the colonial city, he often escapes to an imaginative and idyllic past and removes himself from the realities of colonialism. The pauses and moments of stillness on the itineraries of various characters in Wandering Rocks show that individuals engage with Dublin in different manners. Some characters view the city as a transhistorical palimpsest, some ignore its turbulent past and imagine an idyllic history, and some situate it in a colonial and transnational context. The episode captures how a medieval city transforms into a modern metropolis and negotiates with its coloniality. The episode not only depicts how different characters respond to Dublin's colonial condition, but also foreshadows upcoming anti-colonial struggles. The General Post Office remains an unsaid presence in the episode, which functions as an implicit reminder of the 1916 Easter Rising. Various streets and locations mentioned in the episode, such as Mountjoy Square, Eccles Street, Nelson Street, Nassau Street, are situated within walking distance of the GPO. Therefore, when these locations appear on the itineraries of various characters, they bear an implicit reference to the GPO. During the Easter Rising, the GPO was used as the headquarters by the leaders of the uprising. It was destroyed by fire in the course of the rising and later restored by the Irish Free State government in 1929. The GPO thus symbolizes Ireland's historical anti-colonial struggle. Its implicit presence enhances the transhistoricism of the episode. Its history of being destroyed and renovated stands as a metonym for Dublin as a city that relentlessly renews itself from its own ashes and exemplifies a critical cosmopolitanism. Thank you.
I will add my voice to those who have already thanked the conveners. Thank you once again, and to all you out there on Zoom, thank you for listening. This presentation argues for renewed attention to the decorative elements of Art Nouveau as context for reading Ulysses. What I do links literary sophistication and difficulty with the pleasures of illustration and a tourism for which we may feel some nostalgia. It's not entirely off the mark, as Ulysses can be understood as the offspring of Dickens, as inextricably linked with touristic desires, and as one of the greatest works of sentimentality ever composed. Furthermore, this approach leans on understanding a literary work in the context of its creation, that is, as the product of its time and especially its place. The map of Art Nouveau directs our focus towards continental Europe and associations with the Orient. By putting Ulysses on the map of Art Nouveau, we emphasize, of course, Bloom's reveries and Molly's memories, as well as their author's exilic life. The history of architecture relates Art Nouveau to the picturesque. An architectural theorist, Lars Spoybrook, explains, "A search for the picturesque is a move towards variation, irregularity, and contingency. In architecture, it is often specifically related to problems of massing, freeing the parts from idealist schemes and allowing them to aggregate into much looser configurations. In picturesque architecture, the lines are always of a higher order than volume." In this thinking, my vocabulary is concerned with an ornament of the radicalized picturesque that moves the picturesque away from naturalism and towards pattern, or what Spoybrook calls woven systemacy. He turns to Alfred Gell's Art and Agency, which states that, quote, "decorated surfaces are animated, engaging us in a mazy dance in which our eyes become readily lost," end quote. The decorated surface involves a motif, a figure that twists in a particular way, and multiplicity, a manyness created by translations, rotations, and reflections of many such figures nested into larger patterns. It is here that I note that the architectural vocabulary resembles the vocabularies with which we read the fin de siècle, Joyce, and modernism. For example, Judith Walkowitz's kinesthetic identification, Nico Israel's spiral, and my vocabulary of participatory dance, to name just a few. Here I am moving towards the context for Joyce's animated participatory dance scene, the whirling extravaganza of Circe's pandemonium and waltzing. So to continue my prelude, the vocabulary of the architectural picturesque and the decorated surface engenders then the specific vocabulary of Art Nouveau. A distinguishing feature of the all-important curve in Art Nouveau is its relation to the S-curve or serpentine line of Hogarth's analysis of beauty. Hogarth's S-curve swerves away from earlier notions of variety controlled by proportion and harmony. For Hogarth, the S-curve signifies tension between controlled beauty and the uncontrolled forces of the sublime, or variation without limit or termination in total possession of the mind. This then gives rise to ideas of the picturesque, as in Uvedale Price, as a station between beauty and the sublime, in which variability manages force, keeping order on the edge of chaos. In Art Nouveau, we find something quite ostentatious and obvious, a signature style, the J-curve. It is distinguished from the two loose ends of the S-curve by having one loose end and one fixed end. Thus, the J-curve, characteristic of Art Nouveau, is vegetal. Quote, and I'm still drawing on Spoybrook here, rooted at one end and loose at the other, which moves with the wind or the water. This is Art Nouveau's whiplash curve. For Walter Benjamin, that makes Art Nouveau rather dangerous in its aesthetic of the dreamy, a kind of passive escape and escapism, strangely, again, passive while in movement. For architecture, this is the realm of what Spoybrook calls entanglements, mergences, crossings. And it's also a vitalist aesthetics in which life and geometry are constantly intertwining. This vocabulary suitably describes, I think, Joycean aesthetics. And we can see it, and we will see it in my visual accompaniment soon, Ernst Reichel's design for the cover of Ulysses, the two J's of its author's initials. And we can put that in conversation with the S-curve in Reichel's typography for the opening of that edition, in which the S of stately plump is, as you know, gigantic, opening the text with the serpentine lines, implications of variety heading towards but stopping short of the sublime. For the architect and art historian, Art Nouveau's curves are exemplified by particular canonical works. For example, the 1896 advertisement for Job's cigarettes by Alphonse Mucha, the Paris Metro entrances of Hector Guimard, the wrought iron railings of the Belgian Victor Horta. For our purposes, these curves are also found especially in Trieste, a birthplace of Ulysses. So a brief review of Trieste for Joyce, indebted to John McCourt. On October 20th, 1904, Joyce and Nora arrive in Trieste and move into a room on the Piazza Ponte Rosso. Joyce leaves to work at Berlitz in Pola for 4 months. By late December, Nora is pregnant with Giorgio, while Joyce works on Stephen, Hero, and Dubliners. In 1905, Joyce returns to Trieste, where he lives until war forces him to leave for Zurich in June 1915, and where he will again return in 1919, departing in July 1920 for Paris, and for good. Among his Trieste addresses is 32 Barriera Vecchia, where he lives above a pastry shop, the entrance to which you see, that exists to this day, the Pasticceria Pirona. During the Triestine years, Joyce writes a novelette, Giacomo Joyce, between 1911 and 1914, described by McCourt as a visual log, in which its author grapples with, quote, the clash of complex Middle European and Italian identities and cultures that made Trieste a singular place, end quote. Trieste is indeed remarkably diverse, and I might say cosmopolitan, linguistically, culturally, and architecturally. And I now turn to the illustrated, begin the illustrated section of my presentation. Most of these images are available through gracious permission of the Estonian Jürgen Jarvik, whose blog, Grand Flânerie, became a crucial source of inspiration for me as I obsessively did not go to Trieste, but hunted down Art Nouveau architecture over the last year. These images include many examples of the decorative surface, the picturesque, the curve. It is quite literally the environment of Joyce's writing, the architectural and decorative context reflected in his texts, from the yearning for the exotic in Araby, written in Trieste, to the Orientalist visions of lotus eaters, the seaweed hair of wandering rocks, the floral euphoria of Penelope. And here I'm going to scroll down and pause eventually, but I'm just going to let you look and read the captions. This is exciting. It's the first time I'm seeing it on the big screen. Sorry. This is one of my favorite images, the entrance of that building. McCourt singles out the Casa Bartoli, which you saw above and you'll see again, as the one work of Art Nouveau architecture that contributes to what he calls Trieste's Eastern atmosphere. In general, McCourt's description of Trieste's influence on Joyce relies on a sweeping account of the city's oriental qualities, and that's his vocabulary as well as mine, in its position as, quote, a commercial and cultural crossroads between Western Europe and the East, its exoticism imbricated with its diversity. McCourt does mention Art Nouveau, or Liberty-style architecture, but he moves rather quickly from it, and here I'm asking us to linger with it, alongside an architecture McCourt does not explicitly address. And here I emphasize the imbrication of Art Nouveau styles with a related set of styles, those associated with the Jewish presence in continental Europe and more locally in the tolerant cosmopolitan milieu of Trieste with its particular role as port city of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This direction is indebted to scholars of Joyce and the Jews, especially Marilyn Reitzbaum, and to historians of Trieste, such as Lois Dubin and Sherry Simon. From Walter Benjamin to Anne Lin Chang, critics have argued that modernist abstraction, eventually realized literarily in Beckettian minimalism, arises out of a vehement rejection of ornament, a rejection above all espoused by Adolf Loos. But Joyce's reflection of Triestine architecture is something else. The encyclopedic maximalism, picturesque variety, whiplash excesses, and decorative surfaces we find in Ulysses might be said to inhabit and reflect a corresponding concatenation of visual and architectural styles. With its unrelenting themes of desire, exoticism, and otherness, Joyce's writing resonates powerfully within a mixture of associations wherein we see Art Nouveau on a continuum with the extravagant Orientalist style that dominated synagogue architecture throughout the 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th. So here I will do part 2 of my images. In his account of Trieste's exotic Orientalist architecture, McCourt actually overlooks Trieste Synagogue, built between 1908 and 1912, exactly, obviously, within the years of Joyce's residence in the city. Here I see the Orientalism of Art Nouveau entangled with that of a widespread, long-standing tradition in synagogue architecture characterized by Orientalism and known as the Moorish style. Cultural historian Ivor Davidson Kallman describes this architecture as wavy arches reminiscent of fabled mosques and palaces of the East, with blazing colors of richly painted interiors, adding to the atmosphere of Oriental splendor. In the lineage of this style, popular from the 1830s to the outbreak of World War I, are the Alhambra, the Taj Mahal, the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. These synagogues were built especially for Ashkenazim, not Sephardim, with references to Moorish Spain embedded in broader references to the Orient as a whole. The style derives from and produces confident Jewish assertions of Oriental identity. The Orientalist synagogue contributes to an identity for Jews as Orientals of the West, hoping to make Orientalist idealizations of themselves prevail. Thus, Liberty style curves and decorative surfaces intersect and overlap with the wavy arches and abundant floral motifs of Moorish-style synagogues. And Bloom is the embodiment of this context. He is, in some ways, an Orientalist. His vision of the new Bloomusalem reflects the stylistic concatenation of Joyce's Triestine urban environment. Into Bloom is written the efflorescence of an architecture expressing, I would say, not decadence, but the complex, melancholy optimism, if there can be such a thing, of assimilationist Jews, an optimism born of both anti-Semitism and Zionism in the decades preceding World War I. Whereas Joyce scholarship has generally looked to the textual and biographical sources for the origins and meanings of Jewishness in Ulysses, I propose mapping Ulysses onto Trieste's architectural styles where Art Nouveau and Orientalism conjoin and overlap. In imagining what the effect might have been on Joyce, one might follow Primo Levi, who said of the grand synagogue planned for the Jews of Turin that it was meant to be, quote, an outsized exclamation mark. Trieste, then, might have been both inscribed and punctuated by its architectural designs, to which Joyce could well have responded, I think exactly in the manner of the response to the local that we've heard about today. So I'm going to run through a few more images here. These were taken by a friend of mine a couple of months ago to remind us of Trieste today. And then Casa Bartoli, which was mentioned by McCourt and which I mentioned earlier, was in the Piazza della Borsa, and this historical photograph shows that it was the location of a restaurant and what we would call the second floor or their first floor. There's the facade again. And then here's some images you've already seen in this presentation. Am I doing okay for time? You have 2 minutes. Okay, fast. Conclusion. To imagine Joyce in the whiplashy kinesthetic appreciation of his surroundings, we can then imagine Bloom in the company of Jewish figures in Art Nouveau. Armin Goldberger, whose kosher restaurant occupied the Liberty-style Casa Bartoli's first floor, marking the building's location in close proximity to Trieste's Jewish community. The illustrator and Zionist Ephraim Lillian, whose book designs exemplified the application of Jugendstil to ideas of Jewish modernity. Ernst Reichel, the typographer who gave us the giant S. This constellation puts Ulysses' reflection of Art Nouveau into an alternative context from the one we would find in Benjamin's Arcades project, a notably stringent critique of Art Nouveau as regressive, disturbing, Baudelarian, fruitless, falsely redemptive, cruel, and neurotic. Must it be pathologized? Bloom's name evokes the very flowers of Jewish modernity seen in Orientalist synagogue architecture and in the ubiquitous tendrils of Art Nouveau. A new constellation might also put him in the company of Samuel Bing, who founded the Paris art gallery Salon de l'Art Nouveau, and who belonged to a well-known Jewish business family in Hamburg, which had imported French glass and china. Bing became one of the best-known Orientalists in Paris, a dealer who also published an art journal, Le Japon Artistique, and wrote a book about American Art Nouveau after seeing the Chicago World Exposition in 1893. Cosmopolitan aesthetes, would-be and actual travelers, Bloom and Bing are kindred spirits. And my final images offer further associations and thoughts about the reach of Art Nouveau and Orientalism in architecture and design as context and reception history for Ulysses. These images resist, in a way, the map you'll see, a very homogenizing map, an anti-Semitic map from Vichy, France. My final thought for you is, what if we think of Ulysses as the textual expression of a diasporic minority identity, less neurotic than both melancholy and hopeful, that we can read on the decorative surfaces of buildings and little magazines? Perhaps, too, we can read Ulysses and Art Nouveau to anticipate a move towards bewilderment and rewilding, terms that are becoming ever more insistent and legible in drifts and designs of the urban environment. So these are my final images. There it is. This is just down the street. And there you go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Do we have any questions? I see a question in back.
Hi, thanks so much for these fascinating talks. Eric, I was really, I loved your various modulations of the reading of the 12 on either side of the Rue de l'Odeon. I was wondering, thinking about the French context for this and Gertrude's comment, and this is partly also running through different readings of Mallarmé. Is the 12 in any way playing off the Alexandrine, do you think?
Does that work?
Press your button. Use mine.
My button is on.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, it's good. There we go. Okay. It's possible. I mean, I think that, of course, yes, it could be playing on the Alexandrine, but, and I imagine you can put all of these incredible writers, artists, intellectuals into that location, and I can only imagine what they were riffing off of with the Rue de l'Odeon and the number 12 together. But it's also the question of, the 12, once, you go from 8 to 12, and I was always thinking about, it's not just 12 once, but 12 twice. And that was just one of those questions that, at least for me, felt really interesting. And that's when I had gone to Michael Grodin about, just for a kind of genetic answer to it. And I was wondering if I'd find a different version of it in the notes, like, is there gonna be something like another formatting? Did they actually do the 6? But they did keep the 12. So perhaps it is referencing the Alexandrine, or it's just a number for a street in Paris. Could be.
Well, that's an interesting topic. And I was just thinking, first of all, thank you for drawing attention to that page. I hardly ever look at the first page of a book. But besides the visual symmetry, I was thinking 12 and 12, 24, being the 24 hours of the day in the book.
Absolutely. And this does, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, that I guess part of the inspiration for this is John Kidd's, theory that the middle of the book is page 366. And that's precisely when Nausicaa, at the end of the day, when Bloom, the day turns to night, but it's also when Bloom is going back, is going to be leaving the beach to go back into the city. And 366 is the number of days in a leap year. And so this was Kidd's theory, was that, there was also a few pages before it, I think it's 364, there's the line, done, half by design. And so for Kidd, that was also the inspiration, he was thinking that this was possible as Joyce playing games with this kind of doubling, but also with the hours of the day and splitting things in half. So I absolutely agree. I think that there's a way in which the repetition of the 12 could be a way of also adds up to 24 hours in a day.
Kevin, do we have questions from the virtual audience?
No, there are a couple of comments, though, I'll just throw in, right? One is thank you to Roshana for gorgeous images, and then one is a comment, I think, for Eric from Anne Grange in Paris, who says that they'll be suggesting the name change from Rue de l'Odéon to Rue de Joyce to Anne Hidalgo, the current mayor of Paris, who is running for president.
That's a good idea.
Question over here. I believe we have a hand over here. Okay.
Thank you. I enjoyed all these presentations so much, trying to get this at the right angle. And I was, of course, fascinated by Art Nouveau and the idea of the flourish. But I wanted to ask you, Roshana, in some ways, it seems to me that you depoliticized Art Nouveau, which comes not only from a kind of Oriental spirit, but out of Ruskin and the arts and crafts movement. And it would be typical of Joyce to take the materialist culture and the revolutionary spirit of Art Nouveau out. But I wonder what would happen if you restored that other tradition of Art Nouveau to your account.
I think that, am I mic'd? Yeah. I think that would be great. And kind of in the background of this are sort of various rivers flowing into the presentation, sort of one of which is kind of my own sense of the materialism of modernism, and something I've thought about in the past and which probably would eventually enter in here is not only the kind of the craft ethos that you're talking about, which I would also see in something like the Omega workshops, but also the role of sculpture in modernism, which I think is coming into better focus, and the sort of the way it brings, into conversation a different idea of modernism, which is kind of cold and detached, and rather introduces this sense of modernism as a kind of tactile experience, which I think has things to say that are political, as you suggest, about kind of how to be in the world responsibly or ethically. So yes, I would love to expand it into that and see the convergences. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to everybody for the talks. They were so interesting. I wonder if the 1212 is a nod to both the French and the American or English-speaking readers, and the conventions in English and French of putting the number before or after the street name. And so you have it both ways, but I mean, it's just so great that there are so many ways of reading this. My question is really for Roshana, and I thought this was such an interesting argument about kind of set of inspirations for Ulysses. And you talk about the melancholy hopefulness, and that's a really interesting kind of term for the whole tenor of the book. But I wanted to hear more about the specificities or the kind of how the language or moments of the book respond to what you're seeing as a context. Like you talked about this yearning for the exotic and the Orientalist fantasies and the floral euphoria of Penelope. Would you say more about how you see these influences actually being, blossoming in Joyce's book?
Honestly, that's sort of the next step. I sort of have in my mind, but I haven't spelled it out. But the passage that was referred to last night, Bloom in front of the tea company display. That seems like a paradigmatic moment, and I'm thinking of moments, well, I actually have always loved the moment, and this is a chance to bring in Stephen Dedalus, who's been marginalized kind of thus far, but that moment in the bookstall in Wandering Rocks, where he's feeling threatened by Dilly Dedalus in some ways, and he kind of imagines, again, that sort of drowning agantite of Inuit, and the imagery is of what I refer to as the seaweed hair. That seems like a kind of contrast. That seems more like the Benjamin pathologizing of Art Nouveau sort of moment that I think I would bring in if I was developing this argument further in greater detail with textual reading, and to which I would then contrast these. I mean, obviously Bloom flips wildly back and forth between thinking about, the Dead Sea and the kind of Ceylon exoticism, but I think I would say the Ceylon exoticism could dominate in the end, become married to those marvelous, Penelope moments, especially late in the chapter of, the gorgeous flowers that are just, kind of cascading over us as readers. And I imagine cascading over anybody as they're walking through Trieste, perhaps, or around Art Nouveau architecture on South Michigan Avenue. What was that? The other thing I was going to say? Now I just evaporated. But maybe that's because I hope that gives you some examples. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, for 3 really fantastic talks. I enjoyed them. I have a question for Shinjini, and it was in a way prompted by Rishona's lecture. And I was thinking about the sort of the dance between a critical and a non-critical, or an acquisitive or orientalist cosmopolitanism. And I was wondering, what you outlined in Wandering Rocks, how does it look in other episodes, right? Is it always this sort of critical element, or can we think about this as a kind of a 360 view around the idea of cosmopolitanism in the entire novel?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So what I'm trying to depict is that Joyce is revising the idea of classical cosmopolitanism, which is about having a very solid citizenship status, but then Joyce is bringing in these Irish characters who are creating this new Irish subjectivity, which is suspended between the colonial identity, and they're trying to transcend the colonial identity, and there's also extreme Irish nationalism. So that's the critical part of Joyce's cosmopolitanism, that it is opposing England's colonization. It's also in opposition to extreme Irish nationalism, and then it's bringing in different global influences, but it's also preserving the local specificities of those global influences. It's not a broad internationalization of Irish identity. It is still preserving the specificities of the Irish identity and then situating it in a global perspective. So that's the critical part of Joyce's cosmopolitanism.
Eric, in addition to all the other great hypotheses we've been hearing, couldn't the 12 and 12 at the beginning and end of the line also add up to the 24 books of Homer's Odyssey?
Yes. Yeah, so then if you're into the Alexandrian, the breakdown of the books of the Odyssey to 24, that absolutely works. Again, there is also the other theory that floats around by Hugh Kenner, that the first line of the Odyssey, the first line of Ulysses has 22 syllables that correspond with the first 2 lines of dactylic hexameter in the Odyssey. So, and by the way, people argue with this, but I'm saying it's out there, and Hugh Kenner says it multiple times. So the number 22 is there as well, so why not?
Is there a question at the back of the room? Kevin, any more from our virtual audience? No? All right, well, I think a big round of applause is in order. And I invite you to remain in the auditorium because we are going to have our first installment of Joyce on the Clock momentarily, and it is the Aeolus episode. So again, as Karen said, our watches are attuned to Ulyssean time, and we'll let Eric tell us what that is. I still have a hard time with, the normal Pacific Standard, but the idea here, the concept is to attune ourselves to the rhythm of the book. And so at interstitial moments in the day, we will dip in and hear one of our colleagues describe a short passage from the corresponding moment in the book. So I don't know, I think we're probably about to start that in a moment.
Look at here. What did Ignatius Gallaher do? I'll tell you. Inspiration of genius. Cabled right away. Have you Weekly Freeman of 17 March? Right. Have you got that? He flung back pages of the files and stuck his finger on a point. Take page 4, advertisement for Bransom's Coffee, let us say. Have you got that? Right. The telephone word. A distant voice. I'll answer it, the professor said, going. B is Parkgate. Good. His finger leaped and struck point after point, vibrating. T is Viceregal Lodge. C is where murder took place. K is Knockmaroon Gate. The loose flesh of his neck shook like a cock's wattles. An ill-starched dicky jetted up, and with a rude gesture he thrust it back into his waistcoat. Hello? Evening Telegraph here. Hello? Who's there? Yes? Yes? Yes. F to P is the route Skin the Goat drove the car for an alibi. Inchicore, Roundtown, Windy Arbor, Palmerston Park, Ranelagh. F-A-B-P. Got that? X is Davies Public House in Upper Leeson Street. The professor came to the inner door. Bloom is at the telephone, he said. Tell him to go to hell, the editor said promptly. X is Davies Public House, see? Clever. Very. Clever, Lenehan said. Very. Gave it to them on a hot plate, Miles Crawford said. The whole bloody history. Nightmare from which you will never awake. I saw it, the editor said proudly. I was present. Dick Adams, the best-hearted bloody corkman the Lord ever put the breath of life in. And myself. Lenehan bowed to a shape of air, announcing, Madam, I'm Adam, and Abel was I, ere I saw Elba. History, Miles Crawford cried. The old woman of Prince's Street was there first. There was weeping and gnashing of teeth over that. Out of an advertisement. Now, just preceding this passage, Miles Crawford, the editor of the Telegraph, appeals to Stephen and asks him to write an article for the paper, hoping to imbue what he calls the lexicon of youth into their next journal. However, the only example that he can provide is that of Ignatius Gallaher from over 2 decades before in his reporting on the Phoenix Park murders. But this example falls apart quite quickly because it's not the style, the youthful vivacity or energy that Gallaher brought to the piece, but rather the historical content that Miles Crawford begins to fixate on. His excitement begins to dominate the room as he recalls and reminisces about the Irish nationalist Invincibles instead of focusing on the youthful idea that he seemingly professed that he wanted with Stephen's article. And we see his short, rapid sentences pointing point by point to all the locations on the map, outlining the events on the evening of the Phoenix Park murders. It's feverish the way that he speaks, but the rhythm of the passage as a whole is also kept up by Professor McHugh's going in and out, answering the telephone, and then interjecting into the quick, rhythmic rant that Miles Crawford is going through. But he obviously dismisses Bloom's phone call quite quickly, and this is because the immediate, the present that's surrounding him is something that drifts into a secondary thing. And he's focusing primarily and is enraptured by this historical content that he still seems to be very gripped by. It's clear that Crawford's delight and his national pride are rooted deeply, deeply in the historical. And this directly is at odds with what Stephen expresses in Nestor, that history is a nightmare from which he is trying to awake. We see in this passage also that Stephen uses a similar language, but applies it to Crawford himself in his private thoughts. And it's a very pitying idea of Crawford, the idea that this man can be so distracted by the past and what has occurred, even when he's trying to seemingly move into a more energetic and youthful world. He remains tethered deeply to the past.
So thank you, and I believe we adjourn to lunch in the Rose Court, so I look forward to seeing you there.